started. Welcome everybody. My name is T'oros Roslin. I am the Outreach Director for the Armenian American Museum. I welcome all of you for joining us this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morrison, who will be joining us on behalf of the Getty Museum. This event was made possible in partnership with the Armenian American Museum and the Ararat-Eskijian Museum, and there's a woman here I'd really like to acknowledge, Maggie, if you can just wave to everyone. After Dr. Morrison's presentation, the exhibition will be open. The Armenia Open Wound exhibition is traveling from the Museum of Memory and Tolerance in Mexico City, and it will be on view for 2 more weeks until June 11th. So I highly encourage everyone to please take a look, and we will conclude with a reception outside where everyone can mingle and carry on with the conversation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Morrison. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you all can hear me. I have a nice loud voice, so just if you in the back can't hear me, just wave your arms or something. I'm so honored to be here tonight and to share with you what I know about Armenian illumination. I've worked at the Getty Museum. In fact, on July 1st, I'm going to have my 20th anniversary at Getty. As I tell everyone, I started there when I was 12 years old. So it was very lovely. But one of the great joys of joining the Getty staff was being exposed to other kinds of illumination that I hadn't studied previously. My doctorate is actually in French illumination of the 13th century, and so it's been wonderful to me to really get a sense of what was happening in other regions of the world, especially in Armenia, where the book arts were so incredibly important to the maintaining and dissemination of Armenian culture and identity. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that this evening, and I'm going to kind of take you on a journey, a chronological journey, but it's a journey for me as well, because I wanted to emphasize as sort of a disclaimer that my area of specialty is not Armenian illumination, so please forgive mispronunciations and all that kind of thing. And I'm also, you know, when you're speaking to a large audience like this, it's hard to gauge how many of you know all the historical elements of what was happening in these lands, the different names of kings and all that. So I'm going to kind of go at a lower level so that I can hopefully capture those of you who haven't studied this material in depth, and hopefully it won't offend those of you who have a higher level of learning in Armenian culture and history. So I thought I would start just by talking a little bit about Armenia itself and its history in its origins and in the Middle Ages. Have most of you been to Armenia? Lovely. I have too, yay! I was fortunate enough to go and visit in Yerevan, where I had a tour of the Matanaran by the director, which was a great honor, and really impressed in me the great beauty and vivacity and continuing interest in manuscripts in Armenian culture. But way back at the beginning, I'm showing you here a picture which you know very well, a picture of Mount Ararat, which really is the sort of geographical center and touchstone for Armenian culture. And in front of it, you can see the Ararat monastery, where I unfortunately did not have a chance to go. But the reason that it's so important and has become a pilgrimage site is the fact that it was the site of Gregory the Illuminator, who was originally imprisoned there for 14 years by King Tiridates II. And he converted the king, he converted the people, and subsequently began proselytizing in Armenia and converting the population to Christianity. So in the year 3001, Armenia was the first country in the world to be declared a Christian state. And this really separated it from its Iranian origins. And Gregory, whom you see here in a mosaic, was declared the first Catholicos. One of the great honors I also had when I was in Armenia was that I had a chance to have a private meeting with the Catholicos there, and it was wonderful to see this unbroken tradition all the way from Gregory the Illuminator to the current day. As most of you know, Mesrop Mashtots wrote down the alphabet, the Armenian alphabet, in the early 5th century and completed a full translation of the Bible soon afterwards. And that's another amazing thing to me, because I don't know any other culture in the world where you actually know the name of the person who invented the alphabet. And not only that, but thinking about translating the Bible that early. I mean, this actually happened. The complete translation of the Bible in Armenian was available by 434. And if you think about that in comparison to other Christian cultures of the world, the first English translation of the Bible was not available until the 14th century, 1,000 years after the Bible had been translated into Armenian. So it's amazing to me to think of the fact that the earliest translation of any document into Armenian was probably the Bible and its commentaries. And so it's not really surprised that the Bible itself became the center of culture, became the center of learning, and really became the center of Armenian identity in this time period, because the invention of the writing down, the recording of the Armenian alphabet really allowed the Armenian people to distinguish themselves from their Persian and Byzantine contemporaries. And it enabled them to have a tradition of literature of their own and establish their own religious traditions, which enabled them eventually to separate from the Byzantine Church and found the Armenian Apostolic Church. I just put up this, sorry for this black and white, I found this map incredibly helpful for me, and it's something I go back to all the time, but I couldn't find a nice one in color, so you have to bear with me. But you can see here, just to give you a sense, this is modern Armenia here with the stripies. This is the medieval Armenian kingdom, and this is the Cilician kingdom of the 12th to 14th centuries, which we'll be talking about. But in terms of the strategic location of these two areas, you can see that they really formed a land link between the Christian West and the Muslim East. And so this was an incredibly important area for trade and also for cultural exchange. And we'll be seeing in the Armenian Illumination a lot of influences from the areas around it, because the artists of the Armenian Illumination were constantly looking for ways to reinvigorate their own art by taking elements while still maintaining their real Armenian identity of the Armenian art. The Gospel book itself, which contains, as you know, the accounts of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really became the preeminent book for the Armenian Middle Ages. And I'm just giving you a sense of some images up here of the great variety that we'll see throughout the evening. Even though all liturgical books in the Armenian Apostolic Church are blessed, it's actually only the Gospel book that is venerated, which is a little bit different. And this goes back to a history throughout the Middle Ages. It became so important that Armenian princes would swear their oaths of allegiance. Oaths would be sealed amongst people for juridical reasons, for legal reasons, by laying their hands on the Gospels. And priests would often carry them through the streets, invoking the help of God in times of war. So these Gospel books really became the center of culture for individuals, and they also became the center for families. And we have a lot of writings at the back of Gospel books tracing how these Gospel books came down through time, through families. They were so valuable that we even have some colophons, as they're called, which is just writings at the end of the book, that record how the Mongols took individual Gospel books for ransom, and families would raise money and beggar themselves to get these family Gospel books back. So they really were the most cherished possessions in the church and amongst the families. In addition, because they were portable, they were incredibly important because a lot of artworks were destroyed, architecture could be destroyed, but the Gospel book could be carried with people no matter where they went. And so amongst the different diaspora that the Armenian peoples had over times, it was really like carrying their own identity with them at all times through these Gospel books. So I really wanted to set the scene for tonight's lecture because most of what you'll be seeing is imagery that comes from Gospel books. And I really wanted to emphasize the reason that they're so important and integral to Armenian culture. In fact, there is mural painting, there is sculpture, but really manuscript painting in Armenian culture holds preeminent place amongst all the arts. Now there's about 30,000, they estimate, surviving Armenian manuscripts 11,000 of which are held at the Matanararan. But 500 of them, around 500, are held in American institutions and by American families. So you can see that there's quite a number of these kinds of books spread all around the world. Now, before we dive into kind of a chronological look at the Gospel book, I wanted to start by showing some images of the making of a medieval book, because I think it's really just interesting on its own, but it will also give you a real sense of the artistry and the craftsmanship that went into these books. So this is a Western manuscript that shows a little scribe at work, and you can see he's got his ruler here. He's ruling the pages across like this. And one of the things that I want to talk about is how the actual parchment itself was made. I'm sorry for this 70s photograph. You really shouldn't smoke around here. But I didn't have a better slide. You can see here he's preparing these parchment skins. Most parchment in the Middle Ages was made from sheepskin. That was the most common kind, but we actually have some manuscripts that we know were made on rabbit skin that are incredibly fine. They're very small manuscripts. And the most valuable manuscripts, at least in the West, were made on something, and I know that this is not very pretty to think about, but it's called uterine parchment. Because what they would do is they'd actually kill pregnant cows and only use the unborn calves because their skin had not yet developed hair follicles. So it was incredibly thin and incredibly fine. But you can imagine how expensive it would be to create an entire manuscript out of tiny baby calves. So in any case, moving on, you would attach the skin to a frame like this, and you can see it's actually tied on individually. And you would wet it, and you would scrape it, and then you'd let it dry, and then you'd wet it again, and you'd scrape it, and you get off all the, nasty hair and all that kind of stuff. But in addition, by stretching it, every time that it was drying, it was stretched. And the reason that they did this is, if you think about the difference, people often think, well, what's the difference between leather and parchment? So the leather of your shoes, I'm sure all of us have kept our favorite pair of shoes so long that they actually begin to disintegrate a little bit. Well, all of the manuscripts I'm showing you here tonight are about 500 to 1,000 years old, and they haven't disintegrated. And the reason is, parchment is different from leather in that when you stretch the parchment like this, it actually breaks down the cell structure in the skins so that it does not degrade over time. Leather is cured, which is a different process. So now we've slaughtered our herd of sheep, and we've made our parchment, and we're ready to put it together. I brought a little sample here of what is called a gathering. So all medieval manuscripts were written on bifolia, which is just a sheet like this. And you would put several of them together, nest them together into something called a choir or a gathering. And then when you were ready, you put all of your gatherings in a row, and you'd sew down the center into the binding. So when you're making your manuscript, the first thing that you want to do is you want to write it out, because you need to know where to leave the spaces for the miniatures, right? This isn't printing. Everybody's handwriting is different. And if I pick two people in the audience to start writing out the Bible, which might take you a while, even by the time you got to the end of the first page of Genesis, you'd be on two different portions, right, based on your handwriting. So you have to write out the manuscript first, because if you want to leave a space for the miniature at Leviticus, you'll be on two different parchment pages by then. So here we have just the basic implements of the scribe's life, which are quills made from yeast, which are sharpened and that held the ink. You have a stylus here, which was used to rule the pages, and you would rule across an open bifolia so that you would have even lines throughout the manuscript. And the way that they ensured that was that they actually had a press that had all these kinds of needles in it, and it would press down through the entire gathering, and you do that for every single sheet so that every sheet in the manuscript has the exact same number of lines in it. So they developed all these, what I thought of as very clever ways of ensuring a uniform appearance. Now this odd thing here is not actually a rancid lemon. This is something called an oak gall, and an oak gall is formed when a certain species of wasp actually kind of stings and puts poison into the wood of an oak tree, and this kind of like, I mean, frankly, it's kind of like a big zit grows on it, and that is an oak gall, which you then soak in iron gallic acid, and it makes iron gall ink. Now, another way that you could make ink in the Middle Ages was by taking a bunch of bones and throwing them in the fire, and they would carbonize, and you could use that black, you could scrape that off and also use that for your ink. Here you can see a page where the space has been left with the illumination. You can see the ruling lines that go all the way across that we talked about, and you can see the scribe has done his work, and they've also laid in the idea of where the decorated initial is going to go. So that's just to give you a sense of what the page looks like before it begins to be decorated. Now, one of the things that I think people find surprising about knowing about illumination is that the next thing that's done after the writing is the gold leaf. And so what you would do is you'd lay down a sticky ground. This is something called bowl, which is made from clay, but it's kind of a sticky layer. You can see that this artist here is putting on the halo of Jesus. You can see it right here. And then you would take an incredibly fine layer of gold leaf. Gold leaf is so thin that someone told me that actually if you could hold it exactly horizontal, you can't see it because the eye can't pick up that number of microns of thickness. So incredibly thin layer of gold leaf, and you can see that it's this big square like this. So you have just the area that you want covered in gold leaf. You put this square of gold leaf on it, it sticks to just that part, and then you wipe away the excess. Now, the reason that you want to do the gold leaf first, and I think people always are kind of amazed when they see something like this because they always think of maybe the gold being added last. The reason you want to add the gold first is because the next thing to happen is for the paint to be laid in. Now, this is a leaf where you see the gold leaf is already done, and the text is done, of course, and they've started laying in some of the colors. Now, if you had done the colors first, and you put your square of gold leaf on it, the colors are bound together with egg. And as we all know from having left our dishes in the sink for more than one day, egg is incredibly sticky. It's very hard to get off. So if you laid that big square of gold leaf over it, it would stick to everything. So that's why you have to do the gold leaf first. Here is a medieval illuminator with all of his colors. These are probably little shells that he's keeping them in. And this is just for illustration. He didn't have like giant floating things of pigment. This is a little bit enlarged to give you an idea. But the reason that I'm showing you this is because you can see that they kept all the colors very separate and very pure. There wasn't a lot of mixing of pigment in the High Middle Ages. Pigments were made in a number of ways. First of all, there were things like parsley, which makes a very lovely green. Another one is, these are little tiny bugs called Kermes bugs that you can dry and then you can grind up, and they make a very brilliant, lovely magenta color when you grind them up. And those are actually available in the section in the area of the world that Armenians come from. So you'll see a lot of this pink, this brilliant pink in Armenian illumination. And then colors can also be made from minerals, like this lapis lazuli here, which would be ground up. And depending on the coarseness, it actually has a different reflective quality. If it's a very coarse grind, you can actually see the light reflecting off the tiny little segments of lapis lazuli. And finally, another way that they made colors was actually by chemical induction. So here we can see, I think we're all familiar with seeing domes in capital cities that have turned green. And that's copper verdigris is what it's called, verdigris green. And in order to speed up the process in the Middle Ages, because they wanted the green, they would actually take sheets, small sheets of copper, and put them in buckets of animal urine. And the animal urine had a corrosive effect that would create the green in a very short amount of time. And so they would just scrape that green off, and hopefully after they've washed it, scrape the green off and use it. The binding for all these things could either be egg, as I mentioned, or this is called gum arabic. It's like a gum tree, and this is what it looks like, a big sloth or something that's creeping up the side of the tree. But you could take it off in these bits and then soak it, and it would become the sticky substance that you would use to bind the pigments or even the ink together. And then finally, after all of that is done, you have a binding. And I just picked here a very beautiful Armenian binding that is covered. It's usually wood boards covered in leather. And then in Armenia particularly, people would often attach beautiful ritualistic elements to it, like crosses and precious gems and whatnot. So that just gives you an idea of kind of how illuminations were made in these books. And you can see that it's a lengthy, expensive process. It's not like going to Amazon and 2 days later a book shows up on your doorstep. Part of the reason that these objects were so prized is because they used these precious materials. So I'm starting at the very beginning. These are actually the earliest known illuminations of the Armenian tradition. These come from a gospel book from around the year 640. So if you think about how old that is, it's amazing to me that these have survived all this time. This is a manuscript that now resides in the Matanagaram. And gospel books, besides the gospel portraits, which we'll see several of during the course of the talk, they were often prefaced by a whole series of illuminations that told the story of the life of Christ. And so here we have the beginning of that story, which is the Annunciation. And you can see here the angel Gabriel, who's approaching the Virgin Mary. And she's almost dressed in a nun-like habit, which is probably not coincidental because she was, after all, a virgin. But my favorite part of the illumination is the very thoughtful look. She's like, really? God's going to come and impregnate me? Okay. So there she is, thinking about this weighty responsibility. And then on the other side, I'm showing you the last in the series, which is an image of the baptism of Christ. And one of the interesting things, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see these 4 portraits in the corners. These are the 4 portraits of the evangelists. So this would be the last illumination you would see right before you started the actual text of the Gospels. One of the other interesting things, and I know this is, you're just going to have to take my word for it because it's so hard to see. These 4 elements right here, this is actually a pelican piercing her own breast. There was a long tradition in animal lore that the pelican would pierce her own breast to feed her children. And this was a metaphor for the idea of Christ sacrificing his own blood for the betterment of humankind. And you can see that the pelican is actually placed in a chalice, which is making reference, of course, to the Eucharist and the taking of Christ's blood during the Eucharist. So all of these very, very sophisticated elements of illumination are present right from the very beginning. This is 7th century. If we move in time, this is a manuscript that's actually in Venice at San Lazzaro. And I'm just going to tell you along the way where all these manuscripts come from because I think it's interesting. This is actually a 10th century. So we do have these one set of 7th century illuminations, but the tradition of gospel illumination really gets going around the 10th century. These are the Gospels of King, and I'm sorry for murdering his name, Gagik. Does anybody know? Gagik? Yes. Thank you, Gagik. Who declared himself king of the Armenians in 908. And when he built his palace near Lake Van, he actually invited, quote, artisans from all nations on the earth who could unerringly carry out the king's plan. So he was very interested in having the most talented artisans, no matter where they came from, work on his manuscripts. And I think we can see this in his illumination here. This is the Ascension of Christ, and you can see the Virgin Mary down here, and the angels carrying him up. And if we look at a Byzantine gospel book from a couple of centuries previous, this is the very famous Ravula Gospels, you can see that the Virgin is in exactly the same pose, same color of garment, surrounded by the gesticulating apostles, angels carrying the ascended Christ up above. But one distinctive thing that you'll see that's different is here the angels are rather generic. But in the Armenian illumination, you can see that these are almost guards who are flanking Christ and guarding him on his way up. And that's something that is distinctive to Armenian illumination, which I think is interesting. I've just chosen one other 10th century manuscript, which gives you a sense of a different kind of manuscript. This manuscript was not made for royalty. It was actually made for the priestly classes. And the colophon of this manuscript declares that the priest commissioned it, quote, with all his family for the adornment and glory of the Holy Church and for the enjoyment of the God-loving people. So in contrast to the Royal Commission that we just saw, this one is relatively unsophisticated in its presentation. You can see here, here are two of the evangelists, and they're dressed in very colorful garb, and this is actually the actual garb that bishops of the Armenian Apostolic Church would have worn during that time period. So even though we have a relatively unsophisticated approach here, because this is not a royal commission, and this manuscript was probably made in parts of the lands that were not under direct control of the Armenians, so you can see there's no gold as opposed to some of the manuscripts that we've been looking at. But also, you can see some of the elements of Armenian illumination already being set in stone, as it were. So these decorative borders are something that we'll see throughout the course of the evening. Strong use of color, and these kinds of birds that really enliven the page. These are all things that we'll see over and over that are characteristic of Armenian illumination. So now we're moving into the 11th century. This is a manuscript that's in Jerusalem, and it's the most ambitious Armenian manuscript of the 11th century. This manuscript is unusually large. As you know, most gospel books are kind of a good size like this. This manuscript is almost 2 feet in height. It's an incredibly large object, and it has over 220 narrative illuminations. It is, I was reading about this manuscript, it is the most ambitious program of gospel illumination that survives from anywhere in the Middle Ages. So it's an incredibly ambitious project. The picture that I've chosen here is the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm sorry that this is such a bad photo. Maggie, this is the one that I was hoping you might be able to help me with eventually. But in any case, you can see here are all the apostles. And Peter has been placed as sort of an equal to Christ. He's, as you'll see, the only one with a halo besides Christ. And he's also much larger than any of his compatriots. Now, this manuscript, which was created probably also in the royal sphere, it was also made for King Gakik.
Yes.
Kars at that time was the last independent Armenian kingdom not absorbed by Byzantium, but there were close links with Byzantium. And I've chosen this illumination here, a Greek Byzantine illumination, and I think you can see that the relationship of the figures, the kind of delicacy and size of the figures is very similar across the two manuscripts. But one thing that's interesting about this manuscript of King Gaki is the frontispiece, and this was removed at one time, and unfortunately has become very damaged and cut off, so I'm sorry about their missing heads. That wasn't obviously originally like that. But one of the interesting things is, this is clearly Byzantinizing, but this is clearly influenced by the East. You can see that all of the figures are dressed in these elaborate Eastern silks with an elaborate Eastern carpet below them. And he was, when I was reading about this, it was saying that King Gakik was really identifying with the aesthetic of Byzantine manuscripts, but really saw his own power base as originating from the Eastern sphere. And so you can see they're all sitting cross-legged, which is another aspect of the East. And in addition, these little white things, this is King Gakik and his daughter, whom he had nominated as his heir. And you can see that they're both wearing the Islamic badge of office, which is called the T'oros, that you can see here. So it's very interesting that he was, as I said, taking things from the West, the East, the Byzantines, all of these things were coming together to create manuscripts of this time period. So now we're moving into another manuscript that was not made for royalty, like the one that we just saw, but is an example of early 11th century illumination done, again, in a less sophisticated sphere. Again, you'll notice there's no gold, there's no influence of Byzantium here. The donor is actually represented as a priest with his wife and children, and in this next illumination from the same manuscript, you'll see that Christ is actually presented as an Armenian priest, and this is the blessing of the children. But in fact, the way that they're dressed and the sign that he's making over them, he's actually ordaining them as members of the lower clergy. So it's a very interesting way that we see the donor of this manuscript, who was a priest himself in the priestly orders, was really denominating sort of everyone around him, Christ, the children, everyone as priests. And this is probably because at this time period, this was manuscript probably made in one of the displaced Armenian communities. But the priests of the Armenian church were really the ones keeping the faith and transmitting the culture of the people. So the role of the priest in the culture was incredibly important. One more note about this is you've probably already noticed that the illuminations go horizontally and the text, so you really have to turn the manuscript like this to see the illuminations. And that's actually an aspect of Syrian manuscripts that has crept into this Armenian manuscript. So again, all these different parts of the kingdoms that surround them being reflected in the illumination. Now we're moving into my favorite part, which is the Cilician illumination. And the forced migration of the Armenian peoples into Byzantine Anatolia had begun in the 10th century. But the close links between the Armenian kings in this area of Cilicia with the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader kingdoms of Jerusalem enabled him to declare the Cilician state as a separate Cilician state. One of the things that we'll see about illumination this time period is, to me, Armenian illumination really reaches its high point, its golden age, through the part of the 12th and into the 13th century. Armenian illumination really became the focal point of the culture, and this area in particular became the center of trade routes between the East and the West. So there was a lot of wealth which was supporting the creation of these wonderful manuscripts. Just as a note, as you'll see here, the Cilician kingdom finally fell in 1375 to the Mamluks. And it was also torn apart by interior politics. But during that time period, as we'll see, it really reached its height. This is an example of 12th century Cilician Armenian illumination. And there's a lot of influence coming in from the West because of the contact with Crusader kingdoms. I was talking with someone right before this about the fact that it became very common and very much a mark of prominence for crusading knights to marry Armenian women. And so there was a real conglomeration of cultures in this time period. And so here I just show you a 12th century German illumination to show you the characteristics that were coming across. So you can see here, this is actually Mark shown with his lion, and this identification of each of the evangelists with a specific animal, the angel, the ox, the lion, and the eagle, comes from the West, as well as this idea of integrating animals into what is called a historiated initial. And also you can see here this incorporation of birds that reflects what's happening in Armenian illumination. But even in the 12th century in the Cilician piece, we start to see the elements of what will be known for Cilician illumination. One of which is these headpieces, as they're called, which are these decorative geometric shapes that introduce the beginning of the gospel. The fact that it's written on gold is also something that's characteristic. And then the enlivening of the page with these animals is also something that you'll see in Armenian illumination as we go along. This is a manuscript actually at the National Library of Poland, and you can see that it's an absolute masterpiece. It shows St. John receiving the Word of God and then pointing to his scribe who writes down the Word of God. And again, you can see this lavish use of gold. But again, this is showing some influence from illumination being brought from the West. This is a roughly contemporaneous manuscript from Germany, also showing St. John. But you can see here, see this decorative border composed of abstract elements, including interlace. You can also see that in this German illumination, this gold background that we're seeing here. But also take a look at the way the folds are done. They're almost geometric in their precision. And that's also being transferred over to Armenia. Now, one of the great centers of Armenian illumination at this time period was Hramkla, and the seat of the Catholicos had been moved there in the year 1151 and there had been a Roman fortress there that was used. And one of the interesting things about Hramkla is not only was it the seat of the Catholicos, but it was the seat of the ruling family. And throughout this time period, from 1151 all the way through the mid part of the 13th century, the ruling family and the Catholicos were incredibly close, and was also the financial center of Cilicia at this moment, which meant that the best manuscripts could be produced there. Which of course brings me to everyone's favorite artist, T'oros Roslin. These are leaves that we are fortunate to have in the Getty's collection, and you can see some of those elements that we've been talking about, these abstract geometric borders, and also these birds. And some of the things that really amaze me about T'oros Roslin is his ability. You can see that this is a very regulated page. It's very static in a way, but it's really enlivened by all of these organic elements which he brings around to surround it. Now what we're looking at is actually a series of canon tables. Canon tables were something that fronted every Armenian gospel book. They were invented originally, or written down originally by Eusebius of Caesarea, and they were meant to show the unity of the gospels. So what you're seeing here are lists of indexes, and they have names at the top. So what it's recording is similar incidents that happen in more than one gospel. So there's usually 8 or 10 of these pages, and they start out with events that happen in all 4 gospels, then events that happen in all 3 gospels, and finally you get to events that happen in only 2 of the gospels. And these were really meant to show the fact that although they are 4 different accounts of the life of Christ, they are all the Word of God that is unified in their intent. This particular manuscript these leaves come from a manuscript. The rest of the manuscript is at the Matanadaran. And this manuscript was made for the Catholicos, Constantine I. And I'll just read you the colophon at the back, because I think it's very interesting. This is T'oros writing. Having begun by the grace of the Lord, and by his mercy completed, I finish this manuscript, this holy gospel, which we receive from God, and which speaks of God, in the year 1256, in the shadow of the divine temple, called in the name of the one-begotten Son of God, the Holy Savior. And then he goes on, by the order and at the expense of the Lord Constantine, the godly Catholicos of the Armenians, who with his wonderful powers completely astonished everyone. And of course, it never hurts to suck up a little to your patron, right? He gave the work to me, and this is T'oros now not only sucking up to his patron, but sort of being very humble, even though I think he probably knew exactly how talented he was. He says, he gave the work to me, the unworthy, the one-handed, idiotic scribe T'oros, who is called Roslin. He ordered me to practice the work of writing in this divine book, and to decorate it in pure gold and with precious materials inside and out, according to the desires he had, to give abundantly to all, for all who open their eyes will gain understanding. So I think this is lovely, because to me it shows that T'oros was not only politically very savvy, and not only the most accomplished illuminator of the Armenian Middle Ages, but he was also a poet. I mean, he just has a lovely way with words. One of the things that this colophon gives us very valuable information about is, as you might have noted, he says, the scribe T'oros, who is called Roslin. Now at this time period, only members of the nobility were allowed to have a surname. So we know that he came from a very important family, but there are no records of a Roslin noble family in Armenia at this time period. So we actually think that he probably was the son of an Armenian woman who had married a crusader, because as you might have noticed, Roslin is not a particularly Armenian name. And so there's a very renowned scholar of Armenian illumination named Levon Chukazian, who has put forward a hypothesis that the name Roslin originated from Henry Sinclair of the clan Sinclair, the Baron of Roslin, in the UK, who accompanied Godfrey de Bouillon on the crusade to Jerusalem in 1096. So it's not perhaps he settled in Armenia, married an Armenian woman, and then gave his name to his son, T'oros Roslin. We'll probably never solve that mystery, but you never know what they will originally, or what they eventually will show. This is 2 pages from the part of the gospel book, the same gospel book that is in Montanadaron. And I just wanted to show here, this is an incipit, the beginning of the manuscript, that talks about it being commissioned by the Lord Constantine. And then this is one of the evangelist portraits. And I think, again, it just shows Roslin's amazing mastery of color and form. And also one of the things that he really brought to Illumination, which you might have noticed has been kind of absent so far, is this idea of emotion. You can see here as the evangelist sort of looking down in a very thoughtful manner as he's contemplating the enormity of the task that he's been given. A lot of people have asked me, how do you know that the leaves that are at the Getty come from the manuscript at the Montanadaron? And it's mostly through codicological features. I made this little animation, which I have to say I was quite proud of, that shows the exact way that what we call the area of justification, where the text would have been, corresponds directly between the two manuscripts. And that isn't a normal measurement. It's not a standardized measurement that would be in each gospel book. Each gospel book is absolutely different. So the fact that these have those two corresponding areas of exactitude means that they really are from the same manuscript. Now, in other manuscripts, I show you here a manuscript from the Walters Art Museum on the left and the Washington Freer Gallery on the right. Two of the other innovations that T'oros Roslin came up with was the use of the full-page miniature for the first time. You can see here there's no text on the page. This is the baptism of Christ, and you can see John coming in and sort of floating over the waters, and angels coming in from the left. And you can see, again, this gold background. So again, this kind of illumination that's coming through that T'oros Roslin really innovated is also shown here in a image at the bottom of a page. And you can see here's the gutter of the page. And T'oros has made the image go across the gutter, which again is an innovation you don't see in other Armenian illumination. You can see the three magi here coming in to give honor to the Christ child, Joseph over here, and an angel gesturing this way. A couple of the details that I love about this, look at the little flowers that he's used to determine the space of the magi, which is very different from the gold-backed background that you see for the Christ child, indicating his importance. Also, I love how the fact that the angel is off the ground. See, he's floating in here, so he's not of this earth. Lastly, you can note that there's actually three different magi of three different ages, and the one who is the most senior, the one who has the most wisdom and knowledge, is the one who understands the import of Christ incarnate on this earth. So he's the one coming in kneeling. So all these little details that T'oros Roslin is thinking about and incorporating into his miniatures. Then Maggie and I were talking about this. This has got to be perhaps my favorite Armenian miniature. This is in Jerusalem at the Patriarchate Library. And as you can probably guess, this is the crossing of the Red Sea. And you can see here the people coming in and getting confounded by Moses striking and making the Red Sea come in. And look at this horse who's lost in the water. The way that his head is turning, the way that his hooves are kind of flailing. The guy who's falling off of his back, red, into the Red Sea. This is something that you've never seen in Armenian illumination before. The mastery that he has of narrative is absolutely spellbinding. And I wanted to mention also that we've got an exhibition up right now that shows most of the Armenian manuscripts that are in the Getty's collection, including our leaves by T'oros Roslin. So I just have to put in a little plug to come to the Getty and see them. One of the other things that he really innovated was this idea of the portrait itself. So the clientele that T'oros Roslin worked for was the Catholicos, but also the king Hatum, his wife, his daughter, his son, and his nephew. So he was really working in the highest circles. There are 7 manuscripts signed by T'oros Roslin, another 3 that are attributed to him, and this is one of the miniatures that's attributed to him. This is the earliest known illumination by T'oros Roslin. We think it dates to around 1250, and it's actually a portrait of the king's nephew, Prince Levan. And you can see here that he's presented him in this upright manner. And again, you can see these elaborate silks that he's wearing that have a kind of Eastern flair to them. Later on in his career, I think, yes, 1262, this is a portrait of Levon much further along after his marriage. And you can see that now they're both wearing these sort of really beautiful Byzantine silks, and they're being blessed by Jesus who's coming down. I suspect that this is not damage in terms of effacing a face, but perhaps it's been kissed so often that actually his face has worn away. This is sort of an example of late 13th century Cilician illumination when it's moved into what is known as its Baroque phase. And I think you can see the absolute proliferation of forms and different vegetal matter. And it's very exuberant in the way that it does. To me, it lacks that sort of beautiful classicism that characterizes T'oros Roslin's work. Here you can see all these little portrait busts included in these tendrils that are going up. This is something known from Italian illumination of the time period. So again, probably this cross-cultural. And then one of the most interesting things about this manuscript, which is also at the Notanataron, is this headpiece, and we call this the headpiece that introduces one of the Gospels as we talked about. And you can see these Chinese dragons and a Chinese phoenix at top. So these influences are coming from all over, and the artists are using whatever they find to make the manuscripts even more beautiful. Now we're going to move over to the monastery of Gladzor. These are the Gladzor Gospels, which are at UCLA, made around 1300 to 1307 at the monastery of Gladzor. The monastery of Gladzor, unlike the illuminations that we were just looking at, actually made under Mongol rule. But the Mongols actually gave them free reign with their religion, and in this region, they really experienced much more favorable conditions with the Mongols than in other areas, in that Armenian monasteries were free from taxes. And so the ruling nobility came to kind of associate themselves with this nobility, with these monasteries, to evade the taxes themselves. And so again, you see a close link between the ruling families and the monasteries during this time period, as a repository for all their family wealth. Here we see an artist named T'oros of Tehran. There are about 5 different artists active in this particular manuscript, but I've just chosen a selection of images here, which are amongst my favorites. You can see here Christ with the raising of Lazarus. You can see Lazarus is actually dressed in his burial shroud, but his eyes are open. And here are the sisters of Lazarus begging Christ to bring their brother back to life, which he does. And one of the things that I love about this artist is he's really emphasized the fact that Lazarus was dead. This is a miracle. Bringing someone back to life is something only Jesus can do. And the way that he's emphasized this is not only by having Lazarus dressed in his burial shroud in his coffin, but look at this guy here. He's actually holding his sleeve up to his nose because of the putrid smell of the decomposing body. So these again are the kinds of details that they can incorporate. Now, one of the other interesting things is that here we see Christ. This is a very unusual representation. You'll probably be surprised when I tell you that this scene is the tormenting of Christ. And what's interesting is the artist has made the tormentors look like Mongols, first of all. But even the Mongols realize the divinity of Christ, and so even though they're about to torture him, Christ is the one holding the flail, and they're kneeling in obeisance before him. So a very unusual tormenting of Christ. And then lastly, I picked this image of Christ ascending to his cross. And this is, again, something that is very much part and parcel of Armenian art, in that in the West, you see Christ being nailed to a cross on the ground, and then the cross is raised. In Armenian art, he is the one making the voluntary sacrifice. The Armenian artist really wanted to emphasize that he was fully human and making the emotional decision to sacrifice himself for the good of mankind. So he voluntarily crawls up and puts himself on the cross. And again, this is something very distinctive to Armenian illumination. Now we're moving into the Lake Van region. Now, the greatest number of medieval manuscripts from Armenia that survive come from the Lake Van region. And as you can see, they have a very, very different flavor. we're still in the 13th century. So if we compare this to work that we've seen of T'oros Roslin and T'oros of Tehran, you can immediately see the differentiation here. These are all four evangelists in a row, very simplistic shapes, simplistic decoration, no gold on these pages, and one of the other remarkable things about these manuscripts is almost all of them are on paper, because that was a cheaper material available to the artists. So altogether, these Lake Van region manuscripts have a different flavor. This is a particular leaf that's in the Metropolitan Museum. And you can see that unlike a lot of the illuminations that we've been seeing, they have no Byzantine influence, no Western influence, no Chinese influence. They're purely Armenian in flavor. This is a manuscript of the Getty. And I love this one because it's one of the few images we have of a scribe at work. This is the scribe Petros passing his ink quill and ink pot over to his younger assistant. And down below, we used to think that these were angels with vials presenting them to the people above, but now we actually think that they are assistants, and these are not actually vials, but are made of glass, and they were things made to polish the paper. So they're actually flat and heavy to polish the paper. So that's the current ruling theory, which I think is really interesting. Then also, on this side, again, you have the idea of the human and the divine Christ together. So here you have the sacrifice of Isaac, and he's just about to cut his throat. You can see he's holding him by his hair here. And instead, a sheep is sacrificed instead. But down below, you have the Annunciation. And you have Gabriel coming in to tell the Virgin again that she will have the incarnate Christ. One of the things that I think is so fascinating about these Lake Van manuscripts is there's not really an attempt to place them in space. There's not an attempt to make the figures articulated in any way. It's all about color and line and emotion. And that's what's speaking to us in these illuminations, which is very different from what we were seeing in the Cilician region. So now I'm going to move into the final phase, which is the diaspora of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Armenian communities at this point had spread as far as Venice, Poland, Iran. These communities were often isolated, but again in conversation with the regions that they were in. So there were two major centers during this time period, and the first is here in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This had a lot of direct correspondence with the remnants of the Byzantine Empire. And so you can see a continuation of a lot of the traditions that we've already seen before. But one of the things that I think is characteristic of the Constantinople school at this point is a real lack of vivacity. The faces are rather blank, the illuminations are rather static, and they don't have that life that we saw in the Lake Van region or the earlier Cilician illuminations. So it's really the motion, the emotion, and the interesting iconography actually comes from not Constantinople, but from the Isfahan region and the New Julfa area. So Shah Abbas moved a lot of the merchants and artisans to New Julfa in the Armenian quarter of Isfahan in 1606. He moved over 150,000 artisans. But he wanted to treat them well because they were so knowledgeable about trade and the arts, obviously, that he wanted to make them as happy as possible, even though it was a forced removal. So he treated them quite well, hoping that they would bring economic prosperity to his realm. A lot of these artists also did not have gold, so you'll just see the use of gold in the halos, but in the rest of the areas you'll see a yellow or a kind of taupe image. Now these are again both illuminations in the Getty Museum. This is a manuscript that is one of the most popular with our public. Everyone loves St. John. You can see here he's getting the Word of God. It almost shoots into him with its energy and then comes out the other side. But he's encased by this amazing, movable purple area that just seems to pulsate with life. And the colors are just so vibrant. They look like they're leaping right off the page. Interestingly enough, this manuscript came to us as part of a larger collection that was the formation of our collection in 1983. And then in 1985, 1945, we had the chance to buy another leaf that had formerly been part of this manuscript. So it's wonderful how these things travel around, and then you can try to reunite them when you have the opportunities. This is actually, again, the baptism of Christ, which we've seen a couple of times. But I want to talk about these figures down here a little bit. Unfortunately, the leaf has been cut off. This is a man who is representing the River Jordan. And this is a character that I had never heard of before studying Armenian illumination. It's called the Vishap. Have you guys heard of this? Vishap. So I was reading that, yes, it's like a Armenian version of Leviathan. It was thought that Mount Ararat was its home, and probably the movement of the tectonic plates and earthquakes eventually made it associated with the idea of chaos, the Vishap. But one of the things that I read, and I'd be interested to hear from you guys, is that what I was reading online said that sometimes the legend was the Vishap would come steal children and toddlers in the middle of the night and put a little evil spirit of their own brood in their stead. Is this something that you like taunt little children, like if you're bad, the Vishap will come get you in the middle of the night? No. I have to remember that one for my nephews. And then this is a final manuscript that's also at the Getty, which is actually a Bible. This is probably about the first non-gospel book we've seen in the entire presentation. This is a Bible, and this is actually David with his psaltery, because he wrote the Psalms. And you can see these precious objects, including a precious gospel book that he has, or a precious book of some kind, that he has on the altar. One of the things I love about this is you can see this gem-encrusted robe that he's got on. Even his shoes are gem-encrusted over here, which I just love. Over on this side, you can actually see the figure is actually dressed as a Byzantine emperor with the royal purple robes, just as David is. So again, we're seeing a different side of Armenian illumination. This is probably about the final phase. This manuscript dates from 1615, so it is one of the latest objects that we have in our collection. Although I just was fascinated to see, I just got my new Sotheby's catalog in the mail yesterday, and there is an illumination being sold this summer that is an illumination, I think the estimate was $3,000, that is by a 21st century Armenian illuminator working in traditional methods. So it's very much a tradition that carries on, and that's how I wanted to end the presentation tonight, just talking about the long-lastingness of the tradition of Armenian illumination. How important I think it is still to the peoples of the Armenian Apostolic Church. And it's interesting to me that it stayed a vibrant tradition for centuries after the invention of the printing press, and that Armenian artisans are still making illuminated manuscripts to this day. And I think in terms of T'oros Roslin, who is one of the most famous Armenian artists who ever lived, probably second only to Arshil Gorky. And I think one of the interesting things is we have a letter from 1944 that he wrote to his sister, where Gorky said, "T'oros Roslin is the Renaissance. What electricity the man contains. For me, he is the greatest artist the world produced before the modern age, and his use of dimension is exceeded solely by his cubism. Masterful dimensionality, unsurpassed. I bow before our T'oros." So it's interesting to me that even people like Arshil Gorky, and I think you can see the correspondences between their works, the strong colors, the strong sense of dimensionality, the use of abstract form to bring life to a canvas, is something that's part of an unbroken tradition of Armenian painting. So I'll leave you there. I know people want to get into the exhibition as well, but I'd be happy to take a few questions if I can answer them. You're just so overwhelmed. Yes, go ahead.
My question is, do you yourself engage in creating illuminated manuscripts?
No, the the question was whether I myself engage in creating illuminated manuscripts. Alas, no. I think one of the reasons I became art historian is because I love art so much and I lack absolutely any ability.
You should try it because the spirit with which you deliver your information would be reflected.
Yes. Are there other questions? Well, you've been an absolutely fabulous audience. Thank you so much, and I'll be joining you out there in case you were too shy to ask your questions. Then Getty in the front. No. I told you